One of the standout features of the sixth administration was the success of Operation Vulindlela. Vulindlela meaning make way. OV was established by former Finance Minister Tito Mboweni in 2020 to drive the structural economic reforms required to unleash economic growth, and it's also in partnership with the President. Its first phase is focused on reforming the network industries, energy, logistics and broadband spectrum to ignite competition by liberalising markets. I sat down recently with Rudi Dicks, who is the head of the Project Management Office in the Private Office of the President. He's responsible for supporting the implementation of the Job Summit Framework Agreements, the Youth Employment Initiative, as well as spearheading the OV program by unblocking regulatory challenges that impact on implementation. In his previous role, he was a Deputy Director General at the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, and in his role, he established the Socio-Economic Impact Assessment System and was also responsible for its rollout across national government. He was formerly Executive Director of the National Labour and Economic Development Institute, NALEDI, which was the research arm of COSATU from 2008 to 2013. Rudi studied at Wits Business School and completed the Management Advanced Program and has a postgraduate diploma in Economic Principles as well as a Master of Science in Finance from the University of London. What can we expect from the second phase of OV? Stay tuned to the Monocle Banking Podcast to find out. Now, it's been one of these things over the last few weeks that the entire country has been on tenterhooks to wait and see just how this grand coalition, Government of National Unity, is going to play out. But I think more fundamentally, underneath that is the work that you've done at Operation Vulindlela. And I think everyone wants to know, will that continue as we enter the seventh administration in the second phase? So I guess my first question for you is, before we go into the background, is your job the same in the seventh administration?
To put you at ease and to put many people at ease, absolutely. This is the President's program. The President has adopted this as an important part of the sixth administration, that structural reforms as a mechanism to unlock economic growth, dealing with the network sectors as you've done in your intro. That's fundamental and important. And already you've seen some of the impact in the energy sector or the telecommunication sector or the water sector, for instance, and the visa reforms that has been critical. So the President has given his full political backing. In the seventh administration, has made it very clear that it will continue. So certainly our role and responsibility and the political support from the President will certainly continue in this administration. I think, speeding up the reforms, introducing additional reforms, keeping momentum is going to be quite important for us.
Absolutely. And I know you hosted a conference recently, the SA Tide conference, giving an update on phase one and what you plan for phase two. And I think Sean Phillips, the DG in the Department of Water Affairs, really summed it up quite neatly in that, you've been successful. We'll unpack some of the successes, but the challenge is going to be, how do you keep focused in the second phase on a core select priority list of issues without becoming unfocused? So I think that's really going to be a big challenge. Let's just dial it back. Can you take us back to the overall objective of Operation Vulindlela when it was established as the President's project back in October of 2020? What is it that you fundamentally wanted to achieve as this unit operating inside the Presidency, but then interfacing with various government departments?
Absolutely. Firstly, I think it's quite important to start off to say that although this is the President's program, it remains a partnership between ourselves and National Treasury. So this is jointly run between myself and, then it was the current DG, which was Dr. Duncan Peterson, the head of economic policy then. And we've always had that collaborative partnership because I think very difficult to deal with structural reforms. And structural reforms is one set of a broad economic policy that, the ruling party had set or government had to implement. So it's not the be-all and end-all of economic policy. And that's quite important to distinguish. Dealing with supply side constraints has been a fundamental and important area. And when we set out to work on identifying which particular interventions required, and we set out with the network sectors, partly because, we kind of did modeling. And of course, the conversations was, what would be the most important interventions that could unlock economic growth? It's about economic growth, and let me qualify that, inclusive economic growth. And that was really the big question that we asked. And then we set out and said, well, perhaps the most important part was to start off with the network sectors. And so we have identified 5 key areas. We said energy, and energy was, of course, a burning issue nonetheless, but meeting and dealing with, for example, issues around the immediate supply constraint, but also the long-term reform and creating competition in the market space. Similarly for transport or logistics, because I think that's been quite critical. Similarly for water, and power quota and security of water supply. Telecommunications, you of course are familiar with the fact that we've been sitting on a spectrum, both 4G and 5G, and we just couldn't get it. We couldn't get it auctioned off to the private sector, which of course, would deal with it more efficiently. So that was an important area of work. And then, of course, the visa reforms, adopting and creating a much more agile visa reform system to attract people. And we decided on that because, generally speaking, that in our sense, based on the models, indicated that, if we get these structural reforms right, we could see potentially in the next 5 to 10 years, 3.5% to 5% above baseline growth. And that was important. So it's why we settled on that, and that's what we worked on. And we set aside, we didn't, of course, list a whole lot of things as DG Paul Phillips had said, because once you prioritize and, definitions of prioritizations can be different. Other people think prioritization is 14. We said 5. And then we set about what is it that is in our control that we can change. And that's been the important part of it. It's what we control. In those network sectors is what we can do. Didn't expect anything from the private sector, except when we've done a reform, and we've done that, for example, on energy, in unlocking private sector embedded generation, the market responded immediately.
Yeah.
Today we have a potential of 22 gigawatts of investment. So that's been the kind of history around it. And of course, we work through it painstaking. Second part of it was the methodology. Because the important part of the methodology was that we are not implementers of the reform progress. The implementers of the reform progress are the implementing departments. So it meant from the center of government, we would have to assist and drive that implementation and coordinate it. But we introduced a level of transparency and accountability. So where we got implementing departments to agree on a set of reforms, we introduced, a monitoring system, timeframes, resources that were required. And we held basically that accountability mechanism, as you know, we reported on a quarterly basis since we started, was an important fact of setting that. Because generally speaking, markets and those who are interested in the reform, you don't want a reform to be in perpetuity, for example. Let's talk about a separation of the National Transmission Company of South Africa. We took a decision in 2019 to unbundle, and it went on, and we finally said, look, we need to sort out what the suspensive conditions or conditions required were to be corporatized. And we went about that, and that has been quite critical. So transparency, accountability is important. And lastly, just the political support. Because you couldn't do this if you did not have the ministers and, more importantly, the head of state that supports us.
Right.
Because these are tough reforms, as you can imagine. It meant that we needed to take and implement decisions that had been taken many years ago, sometimes more recently. And so the political support from the president has been foremost, and that kind of importance for structural reforms has been quite critical. And that's really just the successes of what we've been able to do over the last 4 years.
I want to examine a little bit more closely that methodology of collaboration, because it is one of OV's strengths, this ability to collaborate across departments to overcome resistance or inertia. Can you give me some examples of how that worked in effect on the ground when ultimately you are dealing with ministries and the ministers who are responsible for implementing these reforms and doing it in a way where you're not seen to be interfering in someone else's
from
domain?
the top, We've been fairly clear that we're not going to be instructive, we're not going to say you must do this and that. We will collaborate with the departments. One of the first kind of collaborative efforts was around water use licenses, electronic water use licenses. And one of the challenges that we've had was that on average water use license took more than 300 days, and we wanted to reduce that to 90 days, for example. And a couple of things needed to happen. But more importantly, we needed to develop a re-engineering process of how we do water use license applications. And when Sean, the Director General of the Department of Waters and Sanitation, became the Director General, the immediate thing was he said to us, can you guys facilitate resources, technical people to be able to work with us on re-engineering the water use license? That was the kind of collaborative effort that was quite important. And today, 70% of water use license applications are all processed within 90 days. And that's quite critical. That's another collaboration.
Just on that point, Rudi, is that then funded by OV? Is it jointly funded with the department? How, in that level of detail, who pays for this?
So some of it has been, of course, donations and working with some funders who are prepared to do that, sometimes internal funding through the department. That's been the way that we've been going about getting some of the funding going. Right?
Is it a challenge? Access to those kinds of resources? I'm sure everyone would say it's always a challenge. You'd always want more.
It is, but when you do good work and you see an outcome that impacts, positive impact, I think it becomes less of an issue, basically. The most important part is that sometimes funding has to flow quite quickly if you want to see the reform, and sometimes that's not always the best mechanism, but it is always a challenge. I mean, I think resources are limited, but in the limited budget that you have and the small core team and the ability for us to, for example, rely on the World Bank to give us resources, potentially even private sector, that has provided resources. The business leadership of Africa has provided us technical resources, and it's quite important in the way that we manage that, right?
Yeah.
Where we needed technical experts and they are funded. We decide on the technical experts and they are funded. And this is, for example, the work that we did on the visa reform with Mavuso Smang, for example, and the former Director General. So resources are always scarce, but where you're successful, I think sometimes they tend to come, much more easily.
Yeah,
I would say.
Absolutely. Now, when it comes to energy, obviously South Africans are extremely pleased that we've now gone into the 5th month without load shedding. And it's not because we're burning diesel and running. It's because the structural reforms underneath the surface are actually starting to take hold. There is still a lot of work to do, though. We're actually talking today on the 1st of July as the National Transmission Company of South Africa becomes fully operational. And I mean, these are reforms that were first written about in the 1998 white paper. So it shows you sometimes how long these reforms take. But here we are. I mean, it's incredible. The ERA has been published. Do you now move on from energy in terms of your focus and resources, or how much more is there still to do in the energy sector before you start saying, right, we can move on and maybe dedicate more resources to rail, for example, and getting the third-party access sorted out for Transnet?
Like you say, we're not out of the woods yet, right? We're going through a good spell of no load shedding, but we want to be confident that there will not be any load shedding ever again. And there are a couple of conditions for that to happen. The ERA bill, of course, has to be passed, and we have to create a competitive market space. And, as you say, the National Transmission Company of South Africa officially trades from today onwards, creating that competitive market, creating markets, and the market code, for example, to procure on a competitive basis is going to be important. Doing the system operator is going to be its normal function and its trading function going forward. I think it's going to be important for us to continue working on that. It's new to us. Remember, all we've had for more than 100 years is a vertically integrated electricity market where Eskom was, running everything from generation to transmission and distribution. This is complex, right? And so we're kind of 20 years behind what globally has happened. So you'd have to support various players in the market, including the regulator, for example, to be able to understand how we move to a competitive market. And that's going to be quite important for us. The National Electricity Crisis Committee will continue. I mean, I think, as you said, we still need additional generation. We're not completely out of the woods. We need to ensure that we facilitate the private generation. Public procurement program needs to continue. More importantly, this is the next part of what we think is going to be critical in our conversations was EDI, which is basically the electricity distribution industry.
Yeah.
And the reform of it. Everyone knows that this is one of the more fundamental areas and potentially could be a crisis if we don't manage the reform and transition to consolidate and ensure that the EDI sector performs much better. Lots of changes in the way that electricity is produced, people going off grid, wheeling, net billing, all these kind of concepts that have never before been there. Electricity market is quite easy. Electricity distributors would purchase bulk from Eskom and sell it off to customers. The market space is no longer like that and therefore requires a whole set of complex management of this, and certainly something that we'll continue to support. Not out of the woods yet, and I think it's going to be something that we'll continue to do for the next few years, but certainly I think we feel confident that there's a less, so I said to the team, we're no longer in crisis. We're now building momentum on the reforms and resolving the energy crisis so we don't have that. And I think that's really the kind of shift that we require in the way we deal with electricity. But you're right. big focus right now is the area related to logistics. And of course, ports and rail is going to be a critical focus for us to be able to ensure that the one other aspect that is a predator to growth is that.
And it was so encouraging to see the final act of the outgoing minister, Ibrahim Patel, the block exemption, which are still open for comment, I think, until the 9th of July. But it shows a far more pragmatic approach, less maybe constrained by old ideological shibboleths. I just want to stay on Eskom for a little while longer, because it is interesting that recently announced plans to finalize a business case for a pipeline of renewable energy projects, I think just over 2,000 megawatts. And I think interesting for a number of reasons, because there are restrictions under the debt relief package that disallows Eskom from raising new debt for generation, one. And under the JET IP, priority is meant to be given to grid investment. So how does Eskom then justify a shift in focus to generation when you've got this lack of grid investment, which is currently hampering new renewable investment?
No, absolutely. Just to say, I think what is important is that I think it may be very difficult, but certainly Eskom is having a conversation with the National Treasury, who holds the moratorium and the conditions set out in that moratorium. And of course, the big focus for us from the JET team is to look at investment in the grid and the infrastructure related to that. Again, it's also under the moratorium conditions, but in this instance, I think you recall that the minister did say that what he wants to see is significant investment in the grid. And that, of course, requires for us to expand at about in excess of 1,500 kilometers a year, potentially also looking at private sector and concessioning models that are there. This work is continuing, and that's going to be the main focus as we move to trade for the National Transmission Company of South Africa. I suppose the Eskom people would potentially want to see themselves having a long-term future. As you know, there's an extension of the decommissioning for those 3 power stations, Vulindlela, Camden, and the 4th one is Kriel, of course, because that's the next one. But certainly for the long-term future of Eskom, they would have to think about various other forms of generation capacity other than coal. And I think this is really just what the Eskom team is beginning to look at for the future, and for it to be able to sustain itself going into net zero and committing to the NDC targets that the country has set itself up.
Yeah, very interesting. And I suppose amongst the purposes of OV was also to reduce the costs of doing business in South Africa. Yet, just across the road, we've got Eskom putting in an application to NERSA for a 37% increase in tariffs for next year. So, I mean, it just shows you that often you can have policies and projects that risk working across purposes. At a time when you've got the GNU getting to grips with all of these challenges, let's maybe move it on to Transnet. What would you say are the most important areas now when it comes to logistics and reforming our logistics in a way that can demonstrate the sort of wins that we've seen in energy? What are the most important priority areas for you now?
I mean, the most important is to support Transnet, is the turnaround strategy and get those volumes up, particularly in the bulk corridors. That would be iron ore and manganese. Quite important. That Sishan line is going to be critical for us to focus on. And of course, always specifically working together with a whole set of different teams, including teams from the World Bank, from Transnet, again, DOT, through the National Logistics Crisis Committee, getting that. And the other, of course, the other bulk line is, of course, the coal line, which is the north corridor. And that's going to be quite critical. So improving operation performance, getting those volumes back up are going to be important. The most immediate reform is, of course, what's contained in the freight logistics roadmap that we've adopted in Cabinet during the course of last year in the 6th administration. What's important for us, critically, is the corporatization of the Transnet National Port Authority, and similarly, the move towards corporatization in the rail. So fundamentally, what you want is the separation of infrastructure from operations. That's a precursor towards competition. Already there's some competition in the port space with port operators that are there. But in the rail space, there's a complete monopoly, of course. Transnet Freight Rail dominates it. Separating infrastructure from operations, that's important. And of course, the establishment of TRIM, which is the Transnet Infrastructure Managers, are critical. That, of course, is important for us to have open access. And the Transnet colleagues have been quite important in leading through in publishing our first network statement, for instance. And basically, the network statement is kind of like a brochure, basically saying this is the state of the network, this is the lines that we have, this is the corridors that are there, and really basically giving a sense to TOCs, private TOCs, train operating companies. And the most important part, of course, the price, which is the price per ton per kilometer. Point is that it's the first step towards open access. Again, it's about creating competition in the rail space and getting private operators on some of the corridors and lines where we've had massive inefficiencies. Let's use the General Freight Corridor, the NATCO corridor. Certainly, as you can see, Transit has put out a proposal, but again, once you have full open access, quite an important thing to be able to get that. What we want is bulk commodities, palletized goods, automotives, pulp, agriculture, forestry, and sugar. We want to shift it from road to rail, and that's fundamentally what's going to be important. So these are the more important reforms that we want to see come through this year, and the network statement and open access is going to be one of the most critical stuff. Again, creating competition within the rail space. I think there's a lot of excitement in the sector, the private sector, for example. Of course, there's a squabble around the access charge. We'll probably land on some price, which would be important. But again, that's the critical thing for us going forward.
It's encouraging, a lot of work to do as you look to phase 2. I know you've also trained your sights on local government. And Rudi, you've just moved into my neighborhood. So the kind of water problems we've been facing lately. There's just at local government, there's been a significant lack of investment in maintenance and upkeep and building of critical infrastructure. And it comes down to, it's a multi-dimensional challenge. Municipalities are not collecting what they're billing for. There's a culture of non-payment, there are capacity issues. As you look at the thorny issue of local government, I know the two-tier local government system creates duplication and it spreads a lot of resources thin. What are the kinds of institutional reforms that are being considered to address these inefficiencies, and how do we turn local government around?
Michael, just clarification. I think it's important. It's one of the proposals that have been made for the second phase reform. Ultimately, I think it's important for me just to clarify digital transformation is another one. It was a recommendation on education. Ultimately, the GNU would have to decide and Cabinet would have to decide what are the more important reforms.
Right.
But certainly, I think they'll sense that local government is an important area of work. And you're right. Water, electricity reticulation, for example, wastewater treatment, roads, a whole set of different things. I think it's going to be a lot more complex if one says we're going to do this. You have to deal with powers that are not necessarily at a national level, which is quite easy to deal with it. Constitutional powers that are enshrined for local government and provincial government, working with national government, whole sets of complexity. But certainly it is the coalface of delivery. And you're rightly so. I mean, you and I live in the same area. Plenty of water problems, that poor maintenance, and no investment in the maintenance or the refurbishing that is required. And these are the things that are besetting for us. One of the discussions, for example, was very difficult to kind of say, so what do you focus on in local government? Because it's so broad.
Yeah.
And the recommendation, for example, was the success of OV's narrow prioritization. Can we focus on water, for instance? So there's water scarcity, given our country that has water scarcity. Perhaps that's a focus so we can secure our water future for the next 50 to 100 years. Is perhaps a way of going about it, and maybe that's something. But a lot of conversation, a lot of ideas, certainly is an area that is on the agenda of President and requires a bit of focus. But ultimately, Cabinet and the new government would have to decide whether that's an area of focus going forward.
What do you make of the new cabinet? Striking a balance. First time an historic cabinet formation of government of national unity. You've got to accommodate a vast array, a broad church, as they call it sometimes. If I look at some of the ministries, for example, electricity and energy coming together seems to make sense, but you're now going to have to put Chinese walls between policy formulation, so that your IRP and legislation, your regulatory execution, so NERSA, and then your operational implementation. But I'm sure that can be managed. Overall, what do you make of the composition of the cabinet, and how does Operation Vulindlela plan on rolling up its sleeves now and start to build these relationships with all these new ministers?
Well, that's a career-limiting question and potential. The success of OV is to stay away from the politics and the form of government. I'm afraid I'm going to take a pass on that one. We have a GNU, and I think the most important part about it is that, you have the president setting up his cabinet. We now have line of march, and I think we're going to have to make it work. And I think this is quite important for us to be able to ensure that the reform continues. The president has made it very clear that he wants to see the reform continue. So unfortunately, I'm going to take a pass on commenting on the cabinet that's there. It's very career limiting, Michael, by asking me that question.
It's part of OV's success so far, in the fact that you've managed to balance the need for transparency and visibility without getting into the risk of politicizing the unit's work.
Absolutely.
And I think it's something that you need to be commended on. I know some people maybe point to the communication of the office being a little lacking. But I think sometimes you've got to actually operate behind the scenes, and sometimes,
Absolutely.
that necessitates that. Just lastly, Rudi.
I think that's the success. We've been able to work in a very difficult environment. We're up for the task. I think there are different ministers from different political parties. I think that's the ability for us to be able to work with them in the same way, but also some of the different political parties have indicated their overall support for the structural reform program. So I think that's an important part of it. And the successes is a reflection of what we've seen in the changes in different sectors of the work that we've done.
Lastly, what message would you give to businesses, to investors, about the future of OV and the country's economic prospects under a GNU?
I think the message is quite clear. Our success speaks for itself. We were very quiet, as you say, behind the scenes because, businesses and many people, only South Africans, are worried about us making a whole set of promises. We kept very quiet for about 2 years, and of course, we're beginning to see the impact. We'll continue the structural reform program. And I've said to the team, this is the director from the president, is that we need to work much more harder, have much more focus, much more speed, the ability for us to see those changes happening as quickly as possible. Ultimately, what we're working towards is increasing investment, increasing jobs, and increasing inclusive growth. That's really what we want at the end of the day. So we'll continue to work, we'll continue to report, we'll continue to hold accountable, we'll carry through the reforms as it is. And I think that's very important signal, both for domestic and global investors. Yeah. And we'll continue to want to give that message to them.
Yep. And we continue to support the work that you're doing and hold it up as a huge success in South Africa. I know sometimes we can be a little bit parochial and navel-gazing and criticize everything that's going wrong, but I think OV is just such a fine example of what we can do to turn things around in South Africa. Well, that wraps up this week's episode of the Monocle Banking Podcast with Rudi Dicks talking Operation Vulindlela, one of the standout success stories in trying to get South Africa growing again over the last 5 years and hopefully over the next 5 as well. Thanks so much for tuning in, and until next time, don't forget to subscribe.